They insisted humans were myths until the wave surged. The automated grid was burning, but the incoming ships did not fire back. A salvo of heavy plasma cut through the orbital relay, sending sheets of melting copper into the lower atmosphere of Dresch Outpost. The territorial invaders pressed their advantage, locking their primary weapon clusters onto the defense platform. Rail watched the tactical console as a massive human fleet dropped out of transit, their hulls catching the glare of the exploding grid. They did not launch missiles. They did not activate high-yield beams. Instead, hundreds of fast, metallic repair pods shot from the human bays, latching onto the shattered colony relays to rebuild the communication grid under direct fire. No broadsides, no nuclear bursts, no intent to destroy. The human vessels moved in fluid, overlapping circles, taking heavy impacts on their thick armor plating, while their automated systems disarmed the enemy fleet with targeted pulse bursts. Rail gripped the edge of his station as the drifting Thorn shuddered from the kinetic backwash. The wave had surged, and the myth of human extinction was gone in a fraction of a second. The automated grid was burning, but the incoming ships did not fire back. Why did an empire hide for 3 centuries just to save its enemies? Stay close. 3 days before the intercept, the drifting Thorn was hauling medical dry goods through an unmapped sector near the Midrim corridor. Rail ran his manual navigation check, his gray eyelids twitching as he cleaned the corrupt static from the secondary display. A narrow, structured signal thread cut through the deep space noise. It was not loud, but it repeated a geometric rhythm that no natural anomaly could make. Rail tapped the frequency log, letting the internal archive run a configuration match. The terminal screen flickered once, showing a red classification tag that had been locked for generations. Rail left the navigation bay and found Bureau in the lower maintenance line. The young Shalith engineer was clearing grease from a secondary coolant line, his damp skin pale under the emergency work lights. Rail held the data slate out, pointing to the active signal path on the screen. Bureau wiped his hands on a rag, his wide amber eyes tracking the repeating rhythm of the transmission wave. The registry says it is a human emergency band, Rail said, his voice flat. The entry says it has been inactive for 3 centuries. Bureau touched the display, pulling up the historical index. Everyone knows the old stories. They are the reason these sectors are left off the charts. A fast, violent species that burned out their own systems and died in the chaos. But this file is different. What did you find? Rail asked. The records did not stop because they died, Bureau whispered, looking down the dark corridor. The files were sealed by a joint decree. The Council and the humans agreed to lock the public entries under a short note. It says they needed time to heal. Captain Ozen accepted the course change 20 minutes later because the legal salvage rights on an unmapped system belonged to the first commercial ship to file a contact report. The freighter shifted its vector, dropping into the uncharted coordinates where the signal thread originated. The view screen did not show a dead graveyard or empty planets. It filled with hundreds of active, uniformed starships holding a dense defensive formation across the dark space. The ships did not raise shields or track the cargo vessel with target locks. Long streaks of bright family color were painted over their thick hull armor, winding around the plating in handmade patterns that served no military purpose. A mid-sized human vessel separated from the main group, adjusting its engines to match the freighter's slow speed. The comm panel lit up with a clean broadcast invite on a standard contact channel. Rail, Bureau, and Captain Ozen crossed the void in a small transit pod. The docking clamps engaged with a heavy metallic clank, and the inner airlock slid back to reveal a wide, warm corridor. The ship did not sound like a military outpost. It hummed with the noises of a long-term colony, filled with the distant sounds of machinery, cooking areas, and children playing in the secondary alcoves. A human guide named Sierra met them at the entrance line, her uniform plain and free of military medals. She led them toward a central meeting room, answering their unasked questions as they walked past the storage bays. There are 4,000 people on this vessel, Sierra said, her hands relaxed at her sides. The total fleet holds 11 million souls across the generation sectors. We have been out here since the retraction. Why did you leave the map systems? Rail asked, tracking a group of human children watching them from an upper deck. We fell apart 3 centuries ago, Sierra said, stopping at the room's edge. Our civilization fractured across every system we owned. We chose to step back and deal with what we had become before we destroyed anyone else. It was not a retreat, it was surgery. And now you are back to start a war with the expanding territorial factions, Captain Ozen asked, his scaled jaw tightening. We do not need to start it, Sierra replied, sliding a data tablet across the table. We have spent 20 years watching the inner corridors. The factions are moving their primary fleets toward the shipping lanes. Before our ships take any action, we must answer 4 strict questions honestly. Who is harmed? Who is helped? What does it cost the opponent? What does it cost us? The answers brought us here to protect the species that cannot survive what is coming. The crew returned to the Drifting Thorn to carry the formal contact files to the Central Assembly on Verth Prime. The council hall was a massive tiered circle of pale stone, filled with 43 delegate groups arguing over trade boundaries. Councillor Dava stood at the central podium, his pale jade chitin plates catching the iron light as he tapped his platinum stylus against the desk to silence the floor. Dava spent 40 minutes reviewing the freighter's data logs, his single functional eye fixed on the registry stamps. The signal source is unverified under our current protocol, Dava stated, his mandibles clicking with administrative indifference. We do not unseal old archive records because a cargo crew followed an unusual noise in the dark. The humans are an extinct matter. Bureau stepped forward from the gallery line, his voice carrying through the stone chamber. The data matches the position reports from 4 shipping lines. We are not asking you to believe a myth. We are asking you to look at where the faction fleets are moving. Dava raised his stylus to speak, but the chamber's emergency alert cut through his words with a loud, rhythmic pulse. The communications officer on the floor raised his slate, his posture stiffening as the raw data filtered through the network. 3 primary border stations had dropped offline at the same instant. Dresch Outpost, Halon, and the Trade Center at Mayor Cross were completely dark, caught inside the projected strike path of the territorial advance. The assembly floor broke into chaotic shouting as delegates stood up to demand military response plans that did not exist. Dava stared at the flashing alert screen, his bureaucratic certainty vanishing as a junior aide handed him a direct transmission transcript from the border. He turned toward the cargo cruise station, his hand shaking as he opened the broad carrier frequency. "Connect me to the vessel registration line," Dava ordered, his voice losing its formal edge. "Signal the ships in the unmapped system." Admiral Das answered before the automated handshake completed, his tone steady and clear over the speaker network. "We are already moving. We began our transit yesterday because we knew the expansion limits had been reached. We will reach the first colony in hours." Rail watched the engagement at Dresch Outpost from the display of a Council observer ship. The tactical network showed the territorial fleet surrounding the colony, their heavy weapons tearing through the local defense arrays. The human armada arrived in a distributed, nonlinear formation, spreading across 3 approach lines simultaneously to confuse the enemy sensors. They did not fire broadsides into the enemy formations. They launched fast, high-velocity repair pods that attached to the shattered colony relays, bringing the local communication network back online while taking direct hits from the enemy plasma. The human starships used targeted electronic interference to disrupt the invader targeting loops, firing minimal pulse bursts that disabled the enemy weapon systems while leaving their engines and hulls intact. "They are not trying to destroy them," the Council observer beside Rail whispered, her hands freezing over the telemetry controls. "They are disarmed. This is not an efficient way to fight." Rail remembered Sierra's voice inside the generation ship. "It is not about efficiency," he said. "It is about the cost." By the afternoon, the territorial faction filed a formal request for ceasefire talks after their 3 primary strike groups were entirely neutralized without the loss of a single hull. The human rescue teams moved through the debris fields, collecting the enemy escape pods and treating the wounded soldiers in the same medical bays as the colonists they had attacked. 3 months after the ceasefire held, Bureau sat in a small, windowless archive room on Verth Prime that smelled of old paper and dust. The Council had voted to open the human historical records for public cataloging, and Bureau had claimed the task before the administration could stall the files again. He did not find tactical blueprints or weapon designs in the early generation folders. For every log detailing the old civilizational collapse, there were 20 files covering the recovery process. The folders held detailed records of public debates, family histories, and school drawings saved from the long isolation years. It was a 300-year record of a culture practicing its own accountability one day at a time until the process became an unbreakable habit. Counselor Went entered the small room, his old blue-gray skin creased as he watched Bureau sort the digital entries. The assembly was never truly afraid of their military weapons, the old delegate said, touching the edge of a data slate. They were afraid of their clarity. A species that can stop its own expansion to fix its rot is a danger to every bureaucrat who lives on paper. "They left a final letter in the miscellaneous files," Bureau said, turning the monitor toward the old teacher. "It was passed down through the generation ships during the hardest winter cycles." Bureau opened the public Galactic Network entry, typing the words directly into the permanent historical index where any ship or scholar could find them. He tagged the file as culturally significant, locking the translation codes so the text would remain plain and true across 43 languages. Rail returned to the Drifting Thorn, his navigation console now showing an active green path where the human emergency band used to be classified as dead. The line stayed open on a continuous carrier wave, a steady geometric line that connected the inner shipping lanes to the unmapped sectors. Bureau closed his terminal, put on his coat, and walked out into the central courtyard of Verth Prime. The late afternoon sky had turned a pale amber color above the capital levels, and the transport ships moved in quiet, orderly sequences through the upper transit lanes. Somewhere past the charted borders, the painted ships of the human fleet held their position in the dark, watching the static screens and waiting for the next turn.